often hear people say, I don't really cook at home, I usually eat out. So does the feng shui of my kitchen actually affect my wealth and fortune? It is a very fair question because the way we use kitchens today is very different from the way families lived when many of these traditional feng shui principles developed. And the answer is yes. But whether you cook every day is not even the first thing I would look at. An unused stove or stove buried under clutter, an exposed open kitchen, or even the distance between your sink and stove can completely change the feng shui judgment. Hi, I'm Manyi. On Pearlora, I show you what to look for in your home, what it means in feng shui, and what you can do about it. In feng shui, the kitchen is one of the most important parts of the home. It represents the household treasury, your active resources, and your means of livelihood, so its condition is closely connected with earning power and the family's ability to preserve wealth. The kitchen is also traditionally associated with the female head of the household. Her health, luck, and emotional well-being are particularly connected with this space, which is why I never judge a kitchen simply by whether it looks beautiful or expensive. I want to know how the stove is being used, what is sitting around it, where the sink is positioned, and how people actually move through the space every day. Let's begin with something very common in modern homes, a stove that is hardly ever used. Many busy couples eat outside after work and may go for days without turning on the stove. Even boiling water no longer requires it because so many homes now have water dispensers that provide hot water instantly. You may have a beautiful new kitchen, but if the stove goes untouched for an entire week, feng shui reads that very differently from a kitchen where the fire is regularly active. From a feng shui point of view, the stove is meant to be active. Whether you are using a gas hob or an induction cooker, it should actually be used. When the stove remains completely cold and inactive for long periods, the traditional concern is stagnation around the household's resources and wealth. You do not need to suddenly start cooking 3-course dinners every night. The practical collection is much simpler. Use the stove regularly, perhaps 2 or 3 times a week, or at least once a week. Cook something small, reheat food, or boil water for tea or coffee. But an unused stove is not the condition I would worry about most. If the stove has slowly become storage space, I will correct that first. You can picture how this happens. One part stays there because nobody uses the burner. Then you come home from the supermarket and put grocery bags on top. A few days later, there is a box, another pan, and perhaps something waiting to be put away. Eventually, turning on the stove requires clearing half the kitchen first. Stand in front of your own stove and look at it as though you were about to cook right now. Could you use it immediately, or would you first have to clear everything away? In feng shui, piling clutter over the stove suppresses the function of the kitchen. Because the kitchen and stove are also associated with the woman of the household, this kind of blockage has traditionally been linked with concerns around female and reproductive health. So I will keep this very simple. Keep the stove clear, clean, and ready to use. Before buying any feng shui object for the kitchen, I would correct that first. The next problem is easy to miss because the kitchen may actually look beautiful. An open plan layout. Open plan kitchens have become extremely popular, especially in smaller apartments because removing walls makes the entire home feel larger. From a feng shui perspective, however, a completely open kitchen creates several concerns. The first is very practical. Cooking produces heat, smoke, smells, and constant activity. When there is no separation between the kitchen and the main living areas, all of the movement spreads directly into the living and dining space. The second concern is symbolic. The kitchen represents the household treasury. When the entire kitchen, and especially the cooking area, is completely exposed from the main living space, feng shui regards that treasury as being too open. The concern is that money may come into the household but become harder to retain, leading to greater wealth leakage or repeated expenses. You may still earn well, but one expense finishes and another appears. Money comes in, but it becomes difficult to keep. Before deciding how serious this is, however, look at what is actually exposed. Can you see straight into cooking area from the living room? Is the stove immediately visible? Is the opening extremely wide? Or is part of the kitchen already screened by cabinetry or a turn in the layout? Those details change how strongly I would judge the problem. For example, compare two open kitchens. In the first, the living room looks towards a bar counter, while the stove sits deeper inside and partly out of sight. In the second, you sit on the sofa and the stove is directly in front of you across one completely open space. I would not give those two homes the same judgment. If you already live in an open plan apartment, I would not immediately tell you to build a wall. That may be the cleanest Feng Shui solution on paper, but it is not realistic for every family. A more practical first step is to reduce openness of the entrance into kitchen. A bar counter, for example, can extend partway across a very wide opening. With stools in front, it becomes part of the design while also narrowing the direct approach into the cooking area. What I care about most is not whether the bar looks fashionable. I want to see whether it interrupts that completely open line into the kitchen, especially towards the stove. And once you have checked how exposed the stove is, there is another relationship I will look at immediately: the sink. This is where a few feet of distance can change the answer. In many modern island kitchens, the sink sits directly opposite the stove. In other homes, the two are squeezed side by side along the same countertop. In 5-element theory, the sink represents water and the stove represents fire. When they are very close or directly opposed, this creates what Feng Shui call water and fire clash. Traditionally, this is associated with greater tension in the household, more irritation, bickering, and emotional conflict. There is also a very practical picture behind this. Imagine one person standing at the stove while another is washing the vegetables at the sink. If the space between them is narrow, both people keep turning into same area, crossing behind each other and interrupting one another. A kitchen can look expensive and still make ordinary cooking strangely irritating. So it is the distance that matters. A sink and stove separated by a generous working area should not automatically receive the same judgment as a sink pressed right beside the hob. In the same way, two units facing each other across a large kitchen are different from a sink and stove directly opposing each other across a very narrow aisle. So when someone tells me, "My sink faces my stove," is that bad Feng Shui? I will not answer from that sentence alone. I will check the distance first. If you are designing or renovating the kitchen, avoid placing them directly beside or directly opposite each other when you have the choice. An L-shaped arrangement often separates the two functions naturally. If they have to remain on the same run of countertop, giving them around the 3 feet of the separation is preferable. And if the cabinetry is already fixed and moving either one is simply not practical, some Feng Shui approaches use the wood element between water and fire. Green plants are one commonly suggested remedy because within the 5-element cycle, water nourishes wood and wood nourishes fire. Any correction still has to make sense in a working kitchen though. I would never place a plant somewhere that interferes with cooking, hygiene, or safety simply to satisfy a Feng Shui rule. Now, before you decide to repaint the kitchen, there is one color I would be especially careful with. Because the stove already gives the kitchen a strong fire quality, I would be careful about adding too much red across large surfaces. A red kettle or a few small accents are one thing. Red walls, red cabinets, and a large amount of intense red throughout the room create a very different effect. In Feng Shui, that adds more fire to an area that is already fire heavy. The concern is excessive intensity, which is associated with greater irritability, short tempers, and arguments within the household. And the opposite end, I will also be cautious about making the entire kitchen black or very dark blue. And these colors are associated with water, and in 5-element theory, water controls fire. A heavily water color kitchen therefore creates another kind of elemental tension with the stove. For large surfaces, calmer earth colors are usually easier to work with. Beige, light yellow, and soft brown can reduce the visual intensity of the kitchen and create a more grounded background. Beige is actually one of my favorite practical choices here for a very ordinary reasons. Kitchens get dirty. Oil, steam, and cooking marks are much less obvious on a warm beige wall than on some very pale or dramatic colors. So instead of memorizing 5 separate kitchen rules, I want you to look at the relationships. Tonight, stand at your kitchen entrance and look towards the stove. Notice whether it is clear and active, whether it is exposed from the living area, and how the sink sits in relation to it. Which of these problems do you have in your kitchen? The unused stove and open kitchen, or the sink and stove too close together? Let me know in the comments. Don't just ask whether something is good or bad feng shui. Look at the relationship first. That is where the real judgment begins. I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.